climatique, énergétique, géopolitique, économique,
crisis,
le monde
economic
traverse une
crisis,
période troublée avec
geopolitical
des
crisis. We are
conséquences
going through
graves sur
difficult,
plusieurs
troubled
écosystèmes.
times
Ces
with
bouleversements
very
obligent les
severe
politiques publiques à
consequences on
repenser les
several
modèles de
ecosystems. And this
coopération
forces us, of
internationale et
course,
leur
to
impact dans le monde.
revisit
Dans le
the
même temps,
international
des
cooperation
citoyens se
systems and their
mobilisent
impact
et
throughout
des
the world.
initiatives
And
émergent pour accompagner
in
la
parallel, some
transition
citizens are getting
écologique, la
mobilized and
gouvernance
some
démocratique
initiatives
et les enjeux liés aux
are
droits
appearing
humains.
in order to
Bienvenue à
meet these
tous à cette
challenges in
deuxième
terms of
édition
climate
des
change,
rencontres
of
internationales
fair
Expertise
transition,
France.
and
Je suis
all
Fatima
these
Tawan et je suis
challenges.
ravie
Welcome
de vous
to
retrouver
this
pour la
International
deuxième année
Cooperation
consécutive
Conference, and
d'une après-midi
very
de
glad
conférence où
to
Expertise France vous propose
be
un
with
grand
you
rendez-vous
again for a
retransmis en
second
direct,
edition.
deux grands
It's a
panels
live
dédiés au
meeting with
renouveau de
two
la
major
coopération
panel
internationale.
sessions
Globalement, vous
dedicated to the
entendrez
renewal
des
of
experts,
international
des
cooperation,
politiques publiques de
with
l'intérêt
experts,
général,
with
des
people
observateurs, des
representing the
acteurs de
public
l'aide, des
policy
bénéficiaires et
actors,
des partenaires
aid
sur le terrain partout dans le
stakeholders,
monde, de San
beneficiaries, and
Francisco
partners
à Paris, en
everywhere
passant par Manille.
in the world, from
N'oubliez
San
pas, cette
Francisco to
conversation a
Paris to
été faite
Manila.
pour vous.
And
N'hésitez pas à
really,
poser vos
this is
questions
meant
sur le
for
chat
you.
du
Do
site
not
internet
hesitate to use
d'Expertise
the
France
chat
ainsi
on
que
our
sur les réseaux sociaux.
website, the
Cette
Expertise France
conversation et cette
website, and on our social
entièrement
media.
traduite
It's
en anglais
these
et
2
évidemment quand les
2 hours and a
interlocuteurs
half
s'exprimeront en
of
anglais, ce sera
meeting are going
traduit
to be
en français.
translated into English and
Alors,
into
vous le
French
savez,
when
dès
we have
2017, le président de
English-speaking
la République Emmanuel Macron a appelé de ses voeux un
panelists.
renouveau de la
Now,
coopération
President
internationale.
Macron has
Cette mise en
said that he'd
pratique de
like
cette
the
politique
international
est
cooperation
développée
to
par
be
la Team
renewed.
France, à
And
laquelle
this is
appartient
something which
Expertise
is
France. Je vous propose à ce
organized
sujet
by Team
d'écouter celle
France,
qui est en
and
charge
Expertise
de
France is
l'articulation
part
de
of
cette
the
politique,
Team
Madame
France. And
Chrysoula
I'd like
Zacharopoulou,
to give the
secrétaire d'État
floor
auprès de la
to the
ministre de
junior
l'Europe et des Affaires
minister
étrangères, chargée du
with
développement de la
the
francophonie
Europe and
et des
Foreign Affairs
partenaires
Ministry in
internationaux.
charge of
Et on se retrouve
promoting Francophonie and international development. We are going to then start our discussions right afterwards. And my name is Fatima Wane. Welcome to all of you. What is the ambition of France and its take on the revisited technical cooperation? France has a very ambitious solidarity-driven policy which corresponds to its tradition, its vision of the world and its interest, which is to work with our partners to meet together the major global challenges. Since 2017, supported by President Macron, this policy has benefited from a renewed momentum and has seen, within 5 years, an unprecedented doubling of the budget dedicated to development. There's also the law unanimously approved in Parliament on the 4th of August 2021 concerning development and global inequalities. There's also a closer steering of our operators like Expertise France. And as I often say, we must work as Team France, and more particularly with a new method, i.e. working not for our partners, but with our partners. Now, in this development policy, our international technical cooperation is central. Partnerships, relations between people, well, all these mean above all human experiences, and it means much more than just financial support. And this is why Expertise France is so important. And indeed, President Macron and the government are fully committed to strengthening the technical expertise. President Emmanuel Macron announced at the end of 2020 the doubling of international technical experts by the end of 2023. I know this is a major challenge for Expertise France, but I'm confident that you'll succeed. Thanks to unprecedented means, Expertise France brings a decisive contribution to the ambitious French policy faced with major global challenges, and more particularly when it comes to health, an issue that lies very close to my heart. Here, Expertise France plays a major role in our historical contribution to the World Fund of 1.6 billion euros. A substantial part of this contribution will be channeled through the initiative you are in charge of. You will also have an essential role to play in the reconstruction in Ukraine and its integration in Europe. On the environmental front, your experts have the important task to support the country's strategy for mitigation and adaptation to climate change. On the energy front, technical expertise is also crucial so that partnerships translate into a just energy transition, what is called JETP. Last Tuesday, I was in India to negotiate a JETP, and I can tell you that what is expected is more in the form of sharing experiences and technology than just some financial support. Finally, your role is also critical to promote a universal, fair, and sustainable access to essential services, and to meet the needs for competencies adapted to the environmental transition and help women overcome obstacles to get access to social protection and decent jobs. So you see, for each one of these challenges, France intends to support with pride these solutions that rely heavily on technical cooperation. Thank you.
On se retrouve ici pour ces
So
rencontres
back
de la coopération.
live for the International Conference, Cooperation Conference with Jérémy Pellet, who is now with us, CEO of Expertise France, and on my right-hand side, the Deputy CEO of Expertise France in charge of operations, Rima Lecoguic. Thank you very much to both of you. Now, last year, I can well remember when we had the first edition of this International Cooperation Conference, you gave us a definition of a world in common and how Expertise France could contribute to this. Now, of course, 1 year down the road, there's a crisis, there's a war in Ukraine, so we're faced with even greater challenges. Hello, Fatimata, and hello, everyone. Very happy to be with you today with Rima. Now, more than 12,000 people attended our live and replay meeting last year, and we do hope that there'll be many more of you today. Now, within 1 year, obviously, the situation has changed, not for the better, I'm afraid. On top of the coronavirus pandemic, there's now war in Ukraine, also more populist movements everywhere in Europe, and also the energy crisis. And as Thierry Garcin says in his book, there's a new fragmentation of the world. Against this backdrop, one can see that there is indeed fragmentation, but at the same time, also, we are much more interdependent on one another. And of course, we all live on the same planet. And whether we are in Jakarta or Paris or elsewhere, all of us, we want to do better. And irrespective of, of what some people could argue, international trade has really helped a lot of people to improve their standards of living. So what can we do today? I think that in order to face these challenges, we need to renew and revisit international cooperation so that we can have a new deal, a new equilibrium, a new balance in cooperation. In order to design it, we need this balance and this cooperation to be win-win cooperation. This is what France has tried to do with alignment on sustainable development goals and with a revisited policy in terms of international partnerships, as the junior minister, Zacharopoulou, was saying. to do so, we can rely on people. And with AFD, with Expertise France, we are here to support our partners. And I'd say that the way we our take on the world is even more appropriate today. So let's turn to the operations with you, Rima Lecoguic, because you're in charge of operations at Expertise France. There are some 350 different projects across 100 countries, 70% in Africa. How can they be implemented faced with the current crisis? Hello, Fatimata. Hello, everyone. Indeed, just to add on what Jeremy's just said, faced with crisis and with changes that place us in an increasing uncertain environment, we must change our priorities and our ways of doing things, our working methods. Jeremy and the junior minister said so. All of us are mobilized in order to make sure that we reach the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, by 2030. However, Expertise France is also expected to do more in order to help people to participate more in their governments, for more governance, more transparency. Expertise France is also well positioned to organize cooperation on an equal footing between peers on this basis, and sustainable environmental development and social development are very complex issues. Now, in order to meet these challenges, our priorities need to change, and our working methods also need to change, faced with more uncertain settings. And just to give you an example, there are three different ways of doing things. We need to change our mindset. We need to change the way we do things. What is at stake is not to go from the with aid from the global north to the global south, but to build up a long-term partnership with exchanges in both directions, from global north to global south, in the context of projects that are carried out by that are sponsored by people who are on an equal footing. And we need also to make sure that we can put ourselves in other people's shoes, so that we come up with solutions that are jointly constructed with these countries in order to make sure that these solutions are relevant to their environment. Thirdly, we need also to look at sustainability, increasingly right from design stage. We do take into account the impact on climate change, on diversity, and on other issues. And we need also to make sure that people are truly benefiting from these solutions. This is why we want to work with civil society and private partners. And finally, being nimble is very important. We do have some experience in Libya and Syria, faced with critical environments, such that may, for instance, lead to food crisis. We need to be much more agile. Now, Rima mentioned this, but Jeremy, let me turn to you. How did you select the various issues that you wanted to focus on? Well, for today's first session, we want to focus on climatic and energy transition, and its also its links with a social transition. How can we speed up our capacity to adapt to climate change, while making sure that the most vulnerable people are affected by this? We could see that with the price of petrol in France, but it's also something that people are faced with in Jakarta or Joburg. And we're going to have with us Mr. Le Chevalier, who was an ambassador in South Africa and who is now managing director of globalization, culture, with the ministry, and he will share that with us. We know that confidence is at the very heart of everything. Trust is absolutely critical. We could see that in Sahel or in the Middle East. And there are a lot of different things at stake here: transparency, media policy, ethical conduct that must be at the very heart of what is done, the work that is done to involve both the government and the people. And this is a bit in line with what we are currently doing at the ministry, with the Ministry of Justice in Ukraine. Now, during our meeting, of course, we can't focus on 350 different projects. So we selected 4 different projects. Can you tell us a bit more about them? They involve Burkina Faso, Libya, Georgia, and Palestine, Jordan. Yes, indeed. Just to say again that Expertise France is involved everywhere in the world. However, our top priorities are set out by the ministries, and we focus on Africa and in vulnerable areas. And we adapt our working methods to these settings. There are several things we can give as an example. Maybe I can mention 3 of them. The first one is a project that we have in Burkina Faso. It's financed by the European Union, 7 million. The objective is to stabilize vulnerable areas in the northern and eastern part of Burkina Faso. Of course, these 2 regions are very much in the headlines these days. And the objective is to accompany people in occupational training and in job creation. Jobs are really at the very heart of the vulnerability in these 2 regions. So we've worked with civil society, focusing our action on women and youth to accompany them in business creation. There is a second similar project in Libya, where we've been working since 2019 now with a 10 million fund from the European Union. And we've liaised with the ministries in order to simplify the administrative approach, and also here again focusing on women and youth to accompany them in business creations. And there's a third project in Georgia. It's a twinning project. It's a European Union funded project with 2 million. In this country, we have created a peer-based partnership with the Georgian Center for Public Health and the public health institutes in France and Finland. So it's a tripartite project. And the aim is to assess the impact of the governmental policy in terms of air quality, air pollution, and how this can impact human health. Of course, we're going to share with you some footage of explaining this project, so stay tuned. Now, Jérémy Pellet, now let's see what are your expectations. Well, 2 things. Firstly, I expect people to express their views. We are lucky in having Koundounz from the DG International Partnerships, European Union, also Nicolas Djibo, Mayor of Bouaké, different partners. We are going to listen to the people from the Philippines with Josefa Toli, also we'll listen to Tom Osborne. So we're going to get different opinions, people who are experts, who are at the very heart of international cooperation. And we think that this sort of peer-based discussions with partners from different backgrounds is absolutely essential. So before we go on, we wanted to open up our scope and give the floor to people who are committed to international development and the fight against climate change, and who are very committed in their country. And the first of this testimony is going to be from a musician, Abamal, who's been very committed with the communities in the northern part of Senegal and is also an ambassador for the earth, appointed by the United Convention to combat desertification.
On the African continent, we must all make sure that sustainable development is high up on our agenda. First, we need to protect our environment, commit towards the UNCCD, the United Nations Convention Against Desertification. We must fight against deforestation, soil degradation everywhere we can, and also develop land and have new farming developments, also for fisheries and livestock farming. That's exactly what we have done in our pilot project, and we want to do more. And all of this needs to be done complying with this transition, which is important for the entire world, but most of all for Africa. And here I'm referring to climate change. In the Sahel, people are wondering what's happening to them. They need information. They need, with our art, culture, fame, and music, they need us. We want to play gigs, concerts, participate in development projects to change, in a way, the destiny of people on our continent. I am truly committed and determined to use my music, my fame, to work with grassroots people to change things. I think that culture should serve development, especially on the African continent. And that is why I have always toured around with my band in numerous cities, towns, and small villages where you might have maybe 2,000, 3,000 inhabitants, and here we would be using power generators, and everything, all the money thereby collected was given over to local development agencies. And we salute the commitment of our people, especially women and young people. This is a very strong signal. This is an energy we must support to achieve the results we aim for. And also, if we can have exchanges and cooperate as well with countries in Europe, for example, France and other countries who are committed to supporting the African people, then it will be with great pleasure.
Merci de nous retrouver sur ce nouveau plateau, mais toujours au même
Thank you very much for being back with us on the very same stage for our International Cooperation Conference In person and online, we are very pleased to be here with you again. A year ago, as part of the COP26 in Glasgow, an ambitious objective was adopted on the fair transition, so-called French fair transition, for an equitable future to put people back at the core of every commitment. It was thereby decided that the use of coal should be reduced and to further the Paris agreements and objectives. But since then, the world has changed. There is war in Ukraine, and that has increased migrations, and vulnerable populations are even more vulnerable than before. So we'll be right back after this short video.
degrés de plus que les niveaux pré-industriels.
1.5 degree above pre-industrial levels, that is the maximum threshold of global warming that the G20 leaders have set to maintain during COP26. In 2021, the world had already reached more than 1.1 degree. Today, more than half of the world's population lives in a context of high vulnerability due to climate change.
Crise alimentaire ou hydrique,
food crisis, water crisis, social crisis, migration, economic threats, weather disturbances, all of these have serious repercussions and increase inequalities. Faced with that emergency, many states have decided to act and to turn the ecological transition into a fair transition for all, because the transition to a carbon-free world must not be at the expense of populations already weakened by climate change. It's up to states to implement public policies that open up the construction of a sustainable future for all. For the international community and all players involved in cooperation and development aid, the challenge is all about supporting populations towards a green economy, particularly through decent employment and living conditions, by protecting them and respecting their rights. In Burkina Faso, for example, Expertise France has been participating since 2016 in strengthening economic development and local employment programs in 3 regions. The program supports and finances economic development for youth and women. In Colombia, Expertise France is supporting the government in defining climate change resilient socio-economic development objectives as part of a project funded by the FAD. Colombia's ambition is to be a carbon neutral country with a high capacity to adapt by 2050. In Georgia, where the level of air pollution is particularly high, the government has made environmental health a priority. Expertise France is participating in a twinning project to assess the impact of climate change on health, preservation of the planet, social inclusion, protection, development of an equitable circular economy. The challenges facing the world of tomorrow are many, but how can we face these challenges sustainably? What will be the impacts of these upheavals on a global scale, and how can we best support that fair transition? Let's open the perspectives with our guests.
Planet development, protection sociale, comment
Planet development, social protection, how can we best support everyone towards a fair? Let me now introduce our guests who are participating in this next roundtable. Madame Valérie Noël Kojo Diop, thank you for being with us. You are from the West African Development Bank, in charge of sustainable development and innovation, and you come from Lomé, so thank you for being with us. Nicolas Jimbo, Mayor of Bouaké, and also Cohen Doans, DG of International Partnership at the European Commission, and Tom Osborne, co-founder at Green Char and CEO of the Institute.
Thank you, Tom, for joining. Yes, Hi, juste pour s'assurer que ça fonctionne bien. Alors, vous avez aussi,
We just wanted to make sure that everything was working okay. It is also our
Josefa
pleasure to have Josefa Tuli all the way from Manila in the Philippines, co-chair of Youth for Territory, so APAC.
Hi, Josefa.
The Philippines.
Voilà,
The evening.
Un peu intimidée, mais on est contente de la voir aussi. Merci à tous.
We're very pleased to have you here with us. Thank you all for being here. So Aurélien Le Chevalier actually will start with you. So here you are to represent France. And we were wondering, how can France best support that fair transition ambition in the current context, which is rather challenging? Thank you so much for inviting me. Hello to everyone, to all our participants. First of all, there's that rising awareness around the need to act now, to act urgently to fight against climate change. It's been quite a U-turn since the COP15, which was hosted by France. And unfortunately, everything that was predicted by science is happening now. But our actions have ramped up. And since 2017, in particular, our ambitions are made possible with new means. As reminded by our Secretary of State, there has been a rise in development aid, an extra 1 billion every year. And that extra money, that public aid for our international partnerships is more and more invested in climate action. So this is a priority which I believe will never, ever be questioned again. This is a milestone, and there are many other crises to be addressed today, starting with the war in Ukraine and its consequences. But all of this is interconnected, as a matter of fact, and at the core of it all lies the necessity for us to protect our planet. Two main aspects when it comes to climate action. First of all, we need to reduce CO2 emissions, and at the same time, we need to face up to the effects of climate change. How can we go about this is the question. Well, as far as CO2 emissions are concerned, first you need to take a look at the list of the most CO2 emitting countries. And on the planet, there are roughly 25 countries emitting 80% of CO2 emissions. And this is a topic we will address with Josefa, because I believe she has a few words to say about this. And also to answer your question, as part of our latest major projects, as announced during the COP26 last year, we wanted to prioritize emerging economies such as India, Indonesia, South Africa, Vietnam, Senegal, and support our partners in these countries to transform their energy systems. That's what we mean by energy transition. However, that transformation needs to happen, well, not to the detriment of local economies, as you said. So it needs to be a fair transition. We have started to implement new partnerships whereby beneficiary countries define the conditions of transformation. This is not something that should be imposed by external players. It needs to come from the countries, and the countries also need to call upon various streams of expertise to support these countries throughout the years, and then we can discuss adaptation as needed across countries, especially in the south. Valérie Noël Kojo-Diop told me when we were preparing for this panel discussion that there was so much to say about the semantics of it. Fair transition, is this just greenwashing, or is there something more tangible, stronger behind it? Thank you so much for inviting me. The semantics behind that fair and just transition is important. What what do we mean by just? Are we speaking about fairness or balance only? So that just transition concept is rather recent. I think it's quite interesting to have an African element to it. At the WADB, as part of our terms of reference, our mandate, we need to be engaged in a transformation. First of all, for carbon neutrality. We want to lead by example and then support our countries towards the transition, as you rightly said. We must be in line with our commitments. And at the same time, we should not be subjected to certain dogma. So we need to be pragmatic in our approach. As institutions as well, we must be carbon neutral. And of course, we always assess our portfolio. We try to think about the decarbonation of our portfolio, but at the same time, what are we looking to target? Do we want to decarbon it all? Just opt for green assets and we no longer have anyone living there? So you need to strike the right balance. You want to green up your assets and support your states, and that's exactly what we are doing. We want to support them. But some states are saying we are not going to slow down our development in order to obey that ecological transition dogma. That's really interesting. You know, as an institution whose shareholders are our states, we cannot say no to certain types of transition. However, they need to understand that for that kind of a set in the near future, there will no longer be any liquidity. So as an institution, we're somewhat stuck. We are players on international markets, and we need to have players investing in our portfolios as the WADB. But at the same time, there are states, there are our states who say we want to develop our economies, and that is completely fair. But that transition does not need to happen right away. We can go on a gradual approach. And so, for example, in our assets, we could accept these so-called brown assets whilst diluting them and greening them as we go. And as we were preparing for the interview, there's another topic that we addressed, which would be key for our fair transition. And maybe we could keep that for our next discussion, because it will be an interesting example. Josepha, Tolly, maybe we could hear a few words from the beneficiaries of these public and private policies. Josepha, you are in Manila. Could you say a few words about that just transition? What do you think it means, and does it make sense for you, or is it just, you know, a greenwashing communication operation?
Thank you so much. I think a just transition should absolutely be made into a reality. For me, a just transition should mean moving towards an economy that is consistent with living in harmony with nature, and ensuring that we do this in a way that is fair, that is inclusive, and that is just. This must absolutely happen. All the young people who, you know, will have to live our lives facing climate and biodiversity collapse are relying on a genuinely just and fair transition. We are relying on governments and all sectors to really be intentional and to be concrete and to be brave in taking on these kinds of essential system level changes, right? I think to reduce a just transition and what it really means and what it wants to do, to just being like nice words and to just being a communication strategy without really understanding the realities on the ground, would really be a disservice on those who are relying on it to be implemented. I think maybe part of, well, when you talk about a just transition, what it is one thing, and whether it's actually happening is another thing. I think maybe because we don't really see eye to eye on what justice really means and what it should mean, right? As a young Indigenous woman who is very much immersed also in policymaking spaces on biodiversity, justice is something that I think about day to day. I think about it when I see members of our community still struggling for, you know, their rights to their lands that we have lived on and cared for so long, but still struggle to get the rights to. I think about it when, you know, I work with the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, which is an amazing group of young activists who are doing all we can for our future, but still, you know, it's just a way for us to deal with the fear that we feel when we think about the possibilities of an unlivable future because of climate change and biodiversity loss. So yeah, what we need for a truly just transition are mechanisms that advance justice and equity and diversity. And this is our call for decision makers, for researchers, for donors, and for practitioners and public servants, right? We need our actions to follow a rights-based approach. We need inclusive mechanisms for participation. We need access to information. We need access to justice, and we need capacity building, these kinds of things, and being intentional and concrete about them, and making sure that we don't reinforce the inequalities that have brought us to this situation in the first place. That, for me, would be a just transition.
Merci Zacharopoulou qui rappelait justement au-delà de ça l'essentiel.
Thank you very much, Zacharopoulou. You were giving us in a nutshell what really matters with mechanisms that need to be put in place. Tom Osborne, you are in California, in San Francisco. You come from Kenya, but you're in California for your work. Do you agree with Zacharopoulou? Do you also need more than just words? Do you need also concrete and real mechanisms to measure how just this transition is?
Thank you so much for having me. Good morning, good evening, everyone from around the world. I think those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but we also still need to build an alliance that empowers and allows those who are closest to the problem to be able to bring the solutions to reality, right? So I think where I see this is the next generation, of course, requires international cooperation, but I think we should be thinking about international cooperation from the lens of identifying local solutions that have potentially global impact, from the lens of being really able to strengthen the capacity, avail kind of like resources and opportunities for these local solutions to have their own lives and to be able to accelerate, right? I think the thing about, for example, climate change is, of course, it's going to affect all of us, and of course, there are vulnerable communities which are in a really kind of tough place. But the great thing is solutions targeted towards vulnerable communities. The net result is net positive for the whole universe, for all of us together. And I think where international cooperation comes in and where this conversation is timely is, rather than always just thinking about season frameworks and things like that, I think we need to take a more solutions-based approach, identifying individuals who are at the forefront of solutions, building the capacity, building frameworks for, cross-learning and cross, collaboration, because everyone around the world, I think now a lot of people around the world really care about climate change, and we do have that consensus. So the question is, how do we move towards effective change? And I think a solutions-based approach that identifies localized solutions that can have a global impact and amplifies the solutions to have the possibility of scaling and actualizing the impact is the way to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Merci beaucoup. Aurélien Le Chevalier, avant de vous passer la parole, mais
Thank
vous avez
you very
entendu
much,
les bénéficiaires, ils disent
So
il y a
we
quand même
can,
besoin
when
de
listening to
moyens de contrôle, finalement,
beneficiaries,
on en reparlera, mais des
people argue
mécanismes
that you need
finalement.
some
Sinon, c'est
mechanisms
effectivement
and
des concepts un
control
peu creux.
systems in place. Otherwise, it's just paying lip
Très
service
intéressant de constater
to all
tous
this.
ensemble que
Yes, it's
la
very
question du
interesting
climat et la
to
question de la justice
realize
sont
that
liées.
this issue of climate
D'abord
and
parce que
justice
malheureusement, on
are
est dans un monde
intertwined.
d'inégalité.
Well, firstly, because unfortunately, this world is not equal. And because of climate change, there are even more inequalities. So mechanically, the more there are disturbances due to climate change, well, the more there are inequalities and less, of course, we put in place some means to combat this. Secondly, and there's another issue about justice, which you raised. Emerging countries or developing countries are telling us, you know, you rich countries are telling us that we can't do this or that, we can't use coal, we can't industrialize our economy. It's not fair. And it's true. However, if these countries follow the same route as we did over the past 50 years, we're going to go into the wall, and the planet won't survive. So we need to have some financing schemes in place and some solution in place. And as Tom and Josefa were saying, justice should be tailored for people in the field and taking into account their environment. We are not going to come up and invent these solutions. We can just contribute with our expertise, with our support. If, for instance, some communities work in coal mining, but the coal mines are going to be shut down, how are these people going to make a living? And we need to support them. We need to find ways to train them on new jobs and give some hope to young people. And it's all these inequalities we are all faced with, and we need to tackle them all together.
Sur ce plateau pour parler des exemples, je pense qu'il faut être un peu
Now,
concret.
we'll give more examples, of course, because we want to give some tangible, concrete examples.
Peut-être vous avez un mot sur justement là, je vais donner deux exemples de travail de terrain que fait Expertise France.
And I'd like
Pourquoi est-ce
to
que c'est
shed some light
fondamental
on
dans
the
l'outil de
work that is
coopération
done
internationale
in the field
justement
by Expertise France?
De financer un peu plus
And
Expertise France, en tout cas
see
de
why it's
mettre
so
l'accent dessus.
important
Vous m'aviez dit en
that
préparant
Expertise
ce
France
programme,
gets
c'est un peu
the
comme de
means
l'acupuncture en fait,
they need to
au final,
work.
comme image.
While preparing for this program, for this broadcast, you were telling me that it is a bit like acupuncture. Maybe it's not that clear to you, but if you were to compare the world, the Earth, to a huge body, well, it's just like the human body, and with acupuncture you can target some strategic points, and this is where we can come in with our expertise based on partnership, of course. France can find some experts all over the world and harness their knowledge so that they can work with local experts. And all these needles, like you use in acupuncture, we can target them to some specific items in a project so that it is successful, because you can have as much money as you like. If you don't get this local support, it can't work. And just like in acupuncture, you make the circulation and the flow of ideas possible so that you can obtain positive results in terms of climate change and biodiversity. Now, two examples of projects supported and developed by Expertise France in the field with the support of the local government to strengthen the employment capacity for young people and women in Burkina Faso. And the other one concerns the meteorological services in Palestine and Jordan. Let's take a look at these two videos. The employment program of Expertise France in Burkina Faso started in 2017. It now concerns 4 regions. We work with local partners like local government and divisions in charge of occupational training inside ministries. We have brought our contribution to bridge the gap between the most vulnerable people and the policies for training them and helping them to set up businesses. And this we do for women and young people using the non-financial mechanism for business incubators. Before I was given some financial support by Expertise France, I was just a junior technician. Thanks to this financial support, I've now been able to set up my own business specialized in solar energy and electricity in buildings. I could officially create my company and I could find a building for this company. I could also have some equipment in the premises where I sell components for solar applications. With experience, I've managed to overcome some obstacles. For instance, initially, I could not go for large projects. Only small-scale installations were doable for me. And so I lost some business because I did not have the skills. However, over time, with more experience, I've improved and can now deal with larger projects.
The IPSUS project was to enforce the capacity of Palestine and Jordan meteorological services in flood forecasting and early warning. We have equipped both countries with 18 stations. This station collects and transmits water level and other kind of information such as temperature, wind, humidity in real time to meteorological services who can issue then a warning if a risk of flash flood is high.
أكبر التحديات التي كانت تواجهها الأرصاد الجوية الفلسطينية في خلال 20 سنة الماضية.
These services are a special system, and so they take into account atmospheric pressure, and it couldn't be done with neighboring countries because of cross-border situations and in a very limited background. So we needed international cooperation in order to organize all this from one region to the next, because there's no exchange of informations. And so we rely here on this information with the qualitative improvement, and we are at the highest level, the highest international level. We can have everything ready within 24 hours, and if preparedness are necessary, we can put them in place.
The 3 countries. For the first time, meteorological, hydrological, and civil defense counterparts from Israel, Jordan, and Palestine were all around the same table to discuss data exchange, to be trained on the same aspect. The progress made were very important. Today, the counterparts start to collaborate more with each other. The road is quite hopeful for future efforts.
Merci à tous de nous retrouver pour poursuivre ces échanges déjà fructueux. Vous les avez entendus, nos invités sur ce premier panel d'échange riche. Installez-vous, Monsieur Koundounz. On l'attendait justement,
Now we are going to welcome Koundounz, Director General for International Partnerships of the European Commission. Now, just to summarize what we've done so far, let me introduce our other panelists. Valérie Noël Kodio-Diop, the West African Development Bank. She's in charge of innovation and sustainable development. Aurélien Le Chevalier, well, obviously you've already met him. Josepha Toli from Manila in the Philippines, and Tom Osborne, who is in California, in San Francisco, and they are very well-known activists. Josepha accompanies the indigenous population in the Philippines, and Tom Osborne is also very well known for his action, not only in the environmental protection, because he's also created a company that accompanies young people in the field of mental health, which is also a very big issue for young people. Now, we had already started our discussions, and I asked Aurélien Le Chevalier how France can maintain its commitments with regard to just transition faced with the energy crisis and the current situation. We've seen it's a bit difficult. So for you, for the European Commission, it's even more difficult, because we've seen with the war in Ukraine, everybody, all countries have are struggling with energy shortages, and they've started coal-fired plants again. So how can you maintain just transition in terms of crisis? Well, for the European Commission or the European Union at large, it's not more complicated than usual, in fact, because with regard to financial support, we have budgets for several years, to contrary to donors. Donors usually have a yearly annual budget, whereas the European budget is a 7-year cycle. So 2 years ago, we planned our budget for the next 7 years. We froze our priorities with partner countries with this 7-year horizon. So to a certain extent, we already defined our top priorities, one of which being climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and just transition. So it's deeply rooted in our agendas that we have with partner countries. Of course, it doesn't mean, obviously, that from the political point of view, there are no challenges. Now, all of you know very well that following Glasgow, in the aftermath of COP in Glasgow, there were already some discussions with African partners on the use of gas, and also the access to concession-based funding. And all donors in Glasgow declared that we would no longer be involved in the financing of fossil fuels. So to a certain extent, nothing changed for us in the European Union, because what determines our financing forbids us very clearly to finance fossil fuel resources. So we are not allowed to do so. However, with countries such as Senegal and other countries, we have a commitment to work with them in order to try and devise a just transition, while acknowledging that gas may be a transition source of energy. And we know that in comparison with coal or dirty fuel, well, gas does much better. So there are some reservations, obviously. Politically speaking, we can, of course, we know about your commitments. However, all states have to adapt themselves to the current situation. However, I'd like us to take some concrete examples. I know that you're just back from Côte d'Ivoire, so you will tell us more what you saw there. Now, Valérie, before we had our video, you were mentioning biodiversity and you referred to your ambitions. So what do you do at the West African Development Bank? Well, biodiversity is very important in Africa. Fortunately, has got a lot of biodiversity, oceans, forests, and these assets have to be conserved, have to be protected, because they will enable our countries to develop. And of course, I don't want to listen to states that argue that they were not the ones responsible for pollution and that they have a right to pollute. No. However, there are some mechanisms in place for Africa, such as the carbon market, carbon emission market. States in Africa must take advantage of this. There are also some impact funds that can be used in order to work out the value of the impact, access to financial means to design solutions. Diversity is something which is very important for Africa, because it is absolutely essential for us to preserve and protect our natural assets. The blue economy, for instance, and we would like to work with AFD and Expertise France. And we, of course, we think while protecting the oceans, we think this will enable us to grow our economy. And we need, of course, our governments and our teams to realize that these tools can help them to reach sovereignty. So we need to follow the path of energy transition using technologies, and if technologies are not available, well, go for compensation.
In addition, at the WADB, we always take into account societal aspects. When, as part of our assessments and analysis, we take that aspect into consideration. So that ESG approach is a balanced approach with that just transition line. So we try to be well balanced in the way we consider and assess our actions on the field. Mr. Koundounz, you are the Director General for International Partnerships at the European Commission, and perhaps you could give us a few examples of concrete projects in a number of countries. Let me come back on what you were saying. It's very important for us, I believe, to take a little bit of a hindsight and to take stock of what is happening. First of all, in terms of biodiversity and forests, because that's really central. In Africa and in South America, you have the lungs of the world. And when you see what's happening in Africa with regards to forest protection, what's happening is huge. All of the awareness that's happening right now and all of the actions taken by African governments to protect forests is amazing. I am just back from Côte d'Ivoire, where we signed with the Minister of Forests an agreement which was 8 years in the making, and where you have the whereby a code for the protection of forests will be created to protect forests and its byproducts, so as to make sure that all of this is done legally. So when you see what's happening in Gabon and in other countries, it's not just a matter of awareness. There are concrete measures which have been taken. Also, when you take a look at this from an energy viewpoint, the largest share of investments in energies in Africa right now are in renewables. So from a biodiversity viewpoint, from an energy viewpoint, and if you add to this the fact that Africa contributes to the tune of only 3% to carbon emissions, well, that's the kind of figure you really need to bear in mind. We will be right alongside our African partners to support them. In Côte d'Ivoire, that's exactly what we are doing. We support them to protect their forests. And more importantly, we are not just here to protect nature. You also need to protect people. And everything we do in cocoa, for example, for Côte d'Ivoire, this is a key pillar in their economy, and cocoa can lead to deforestation if it is not properly managed. So we are working with Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, who together account for 70% of world cocoa production, to implement a system thanks to which farmers are better remunerated. And that is a fundamental question. When you see what these people earn in terms of livelihood, that's anything but sustainable. So they need to be better paid. And when it comes to anti-deforestation and the fight against child labor, that's the kind of measure that is key. And there is a willpower and an intention to do so from these governments, but they need to be supported. Right, so you got here late, but you want to speak more than others. Please interrupt me. No, but what you were saying about forests is very important. We participated in a number of conferences for sustainable cocoa, and also for oceans. You have the same kind of measures which are being implemented. I mean, fisheries are a sort of employment, you know, with aquaculture, etc. Well, let us listen to young people as well. Josefa, you are here with us from Manila. Maybe we could say a few words about this. We do not have so much time ahead of us, but, you know, funding. How can we fund that ecological transition? Whether it is, I mean, in order for it to be just, who's going to pay? Josefa, as we were preparing for the interview, you told me that, well, the polluter pays principle should be applied for that fair transition to happen.
Absolutely. What we really need are strong regulations to be in place so that the big polluters who have industrialized at the expense of biodiversity and who exploited resources historically should be paying the costs for their pollution. These costs that are currently, you know, being borne by the people in vulnerable situations, people like indigenous peoples, like women, like youth. This absolutely needs to happen. And aside from that, developed countries really need to be fulfilling their financial obligations in good faith, you know, with the understanding that developing countries where most of the biodiversity is found can only do as much as the resources that is available for them to implement. And finally, like a very important point I would like to stress is to whom is this funding going to? Is it really flowing to the ground? Is it going to the indigenous peoples who protect biodiversity on their territories with their own hands? Is it going to the women? Is it going to the young people? Is it going to the smallholder farmers, for example? Or are the mechanisms that exist so bureaucratic and so inaccessible that a very insignificant amount really flows to the ground? And this has been our experience. You know, resources need to be accessible to those who also do conservation yeah, like I said, with their own hands. And that is the only way that we can really make financing and resources make a big difference.
Il faut que l'argent arrive aux bénéficiaires justement et ceux qui connaissent sur le terrain.
Definitely money needs to get to the beneficiaries on the ground. Tom Osborne, perhaps you could say a few words about funding too. As beneficiary, what is your vision? Would you agree with Josepha with the polluter pays principle?
I agree, but I also do have a slightly different perspective. Yes, where I think about this funding, being more of catalyst funding, because if you think about it from the long run, we need, like for the long run, as you're scaling up solutions, we need to figure out like long-term sustainability and long-term stability around funding as well, right? And so I think the approach where we have, the French, European Union, etc., funding from a catalyst perspective, catalyzing this change, trying to help build organizations, and not just funding, but also in terms of capacity building and empowering, so that we can eventually have strong, sustainable organizations locally. And just an example of an approach which I think needs to be accelerated is AFD has a fund for innovation and development, which I think does a few like pilot transition to scale testing and transitioning to scale types of funding between I think 50 to 4 million euros. And I think this is one approach where you are not only helping financially, but also building the expertise, the capacity of local organizations, because eventually we need to not have to depend on international, funding to solve climate change for indigenous communities. We need it now to start the process, but we need to move away from that dependency, and we need to build solutions that work for local people sustainably indefinitely, right? And so my approach is right now we use resources from the West mostly, but we think about it as catalyst resources rather than indefinite support systems.
Absolument. Merci, Tom Osborne, d'avoir apporté.
Thank you so much, Tom Osborne, for
je voudrais qu'on passe aux questions.
Your insights on the matter. Maybe we can move on to the questions posted by the audience. Please feel free to ask all of your questions. This is an interactive discussion. This International Cooperation Conference is entirely dedicated to you, so please feel free to do so. I'll be very pleased to ask your questions. A question was posted for Aurélien Le Chevalier by Albert Camillus.
Je ne sais pas. Alors, je vous la donne telle quelle. L'idée de partenariat, co-construction et d'échange réciproque.
The idea of partnerships as co-construction and reciprocal exchanges is relevant, but how can we draw lessons from the past to best frame our actions in the future? Sometimes geopolitics can mingle along the way. You have 2 hours to answer. Okay, so the reincarnation of Albert Camus. Quite a difficult question, so apparently it had to be for the European Commission. A very relevant question indeed. We have touched upon extremely important topics in our conversation so far. We've spoken about the efficiency and efficacy of our cooperation, and we have seen that in order to be efficient, it needs to be co-constructed by our partners. It needs to garner upon specialized expertise at the right place at the right time. We are much more interdependent than what we would have thought 10 years ago. For example, for forests, oceans, biodiversity topics, we would have worked in science silos 10 years ago, but as far as carbon wells are concerned, or coastlines and oceans, all of this is interconnected. We have seen also that you need the involvement of local communities for projects to be efficient, which brings me back to the issue of social protection. Local communities need to feel better protected thanks to our cooperation. And also, there's the questions of lessons to be drawn from the past. And as Tom was saying, in a way, innovation. When it comes to innovation and creativity, there's so much to be done. And we have created a fund for innovation and development for the past 2 years in order to assess the impact of these particularly innovative projects. And if they're successful, we scale them up. But as I understood in the question, generally speaking, when it comes to cooperation and development, it's very hard to have an assessment that's relevant for a whole host of reasons. First of all, there are so many factors that come into play, and circumstances change so much that it's really hard to measure what's owed to funding and expertise in relation with the result that's observed. Number two, when it comes to timing, you're going to decide and co-construct a budget, then you're going to implement it, and then you're going to measure the results. And very often, well, as human beings, naturally, we're going to move on directly to the next project that's on our agenda, and we're not necessarily going to take enough time to take stock. And yet, that's necessary. We can no longer afford to make any mistakes. Absolutely. Well, actually, maybe you could shed a European light on what was just said by Aurélien Le Chevalier for France, Koen Dunch. Maybe you could say a few words about, the lessons that we need to draw from the past. Which brings us back to what you were saying at the start. There's a connection between both. In the current context, I'm not exactly sure that geopolitics is so negative. It seems you're very positive today. Well, for me, a real lesson to be drawn in what we do is very often we tackle today's emergency, and in doing so, we miss out on tomorrow's emergency. Geopolitics has exposed, in a way, the vulnerability of that we are experiencing in today's globalized world with integrated value chains, which means that whenever there are disruptions, whether it be COVID or the Russian war on Ukraine, there are vulnerabilities that are exposed. And so we are currently strengthening our resilience. But that resilience will be useful for tomorrow's crisis. Africa, when COVID-19 struck, for example, they felt very strongly that they did not have any production facilities or vaccinations in Africa. And so they set a very ambitious objective to produce 70% of vaccinations in Africa by 2040. So that vulnerability could be felt by everyone. And in Africa had that very strong ambition by 2040. And Europe, our member states, our private sector said, well, we want to be your ally. And so there are pharmaceutical companies which are investing, and we're supporting them. However, that's not resolving today's problem. And yet, it's very important for tomorrow's challenges. And all too often, in what we do, we care more for what's happening today than what will be happening tomorrow. When it comes to food security, the strengthening of the food security system, we really do need to get down to work seriously as of today. Thank you very much, Kunduz. Unfortunately, this is the end of our first roundtable. Very short, I know, but there you go. So be it. That means that at least people will be interested and will come back as part of the third edition of our International Cooperation Conference. Thank you very much, Kunduz. Thank you, Valérie Noël Kodjo-Diop. Thank you, Aurélien Le Chevalier. And of course, our speakers from Manila, Joseph Fatuli and Tom Osborne, live from California. So, Tom Osborne, we know that you are an activist in mental health. That's very important for you. And we invite all of our participants to take a look at your website. Thank you very much for joining and this first roundtable, for tuning in. And this is not the end of our International Cooperation Conference. Far from it. We are going to move on to our next session. There's one topic we really addressed last year, not so much for the moment, health and COVID-19. Maybe that's because other crises have emerged. In the meantime, there will be two examples from the field. Health in Georgia, the objective is to take into account that health is taken into consideration as part of a new urban development plan. And the other example is from a support program to Libya with the EU4PSL program, a program that's financed by the EU to support the private sector. And I would imagine that Mr. Kunduz knows this program very well. So we'll take a look at this video and we'll be right back afterwards.
Health impact assessments are quite a new tool for decision making. Their aim is to make sure that health is taken into account when designing a new strategic plan, like an urban plan for a city. They give concrete recommendations on how to mitigate the negative impacts like air pollution or heat waves, but they also promote health and equity, like better access to healthcare and social services, and to green spaces. Our project is financed by the European Union and implemented by Georgia, France, and Finland. It aims at improving the legislative framework for health impact assessment in line with European and international standards, but we also support the capacity building of our partners in implementing health impact assessments, and we aim at increasing the public participation in the process through different means like surveys, consultation, targeted communication, walks around the city, but also public hearings.
In France, we have experimented health impact assessment for several years now. And what is interesting is in this methodology is that you can both consider a large panel of determinants of health, such as environmental health, such air pollution, noise, sedentariness, and also on social and individual determinants of health. So it's also a way to make concrete the concept of health in all policies and the concept of healthy urban planning. The project seems to be really promising. And we think that after that, I think it's very interesting also for France to to receive this experiment and then to be able to translate all the output also in France and also in Finland and also in Czechia. So it's a really win-win project, very interesting one.
In the framework of the support that Expertise France is providing to Libya, we developed and implemented EU4PSL, a program funded by the European Union to support the Libyan private sector. We achieved a lot of very interesting and relevant results, concretely with the development of digital platforms, Ejrat, Euromed Trade Help Desk together with ITC. We also supported the entrepreneurship education online with Libus, more than 13,000 subscribers, offline with the entrepreneurship curriculum in several universities already installed today. We also supported directly the startup and the entrepreneurs. More than 500 of them participated to our activities.
صاحبة مشروع السجاير لمنتجات العناية الطبيعية الآمنة. حبيت نطور مشروعي أكثر رغم الصعوبات اللي نتعرض لها. التحديات هذه بالضبط هي كوني امرأة، حرية الحركة، التنقل، التعامل مع المصارف، التعاملات المالية، التعامل مع التجار، مثلا البحث عن السوق.
Now I'm launching my shop for natural cosmetics, and the acceleration program of Expertise France helped me.
برنامج مسرعة الأعمال أو تسريع الأعمال مقدم من خبراء فرنسا.
Now the acceleration program helped me to find premises for my business. They are now use these premises for training and large-scale production. This has created jobs for many women. So the program also helped me to improve my business knowledge, also know more about the sales growth, entrepreneurship, and planning for the next 5 years. Things were preventing me from moving forward, but now I've been able to create a production line for larger production.
All these efforts aiming at the support of the economic development in Libya and the economic diversification.
De retour ici sur ce plateau pour poursuivre notre conversation entamée depuis une bonne heure maintenant, 1h30 déjà, autour de la coopération et des enjeux de la rencontre de coopération internationale d'Expertise France. Premier débat riche, intéressant. On aurait voulu en parler encore plus de tous ces enjeux réduits à la transition juste, mais le temps nous est compté. Et alors, on passe à notre deuxième débat concernant la gouvernance et la résilience de l'État. Quels enjeux de la coopération internationale? Vous savez, le 24 février dernier, l'agression de l'Ukraine a plongé le monde dans une autre plus
with the start of the war by Russia against Ukraine, resilience and governance are at the very heart of international cooperation. How can we contribute to changing the mindsets throughout the world? And because we all know that corruption isn't found only in developing countries. So let's take a look at the let's have an overview of the situation with this very short film, and then we will welcome our panelists. Today, close to 1 billion people in the world live in unstable or conflict-ridden regions. This prevents the development of these societies. Often, lack of trust between citizens and their governments lie at the heart of many of these crises. To improve this, public policies are devised to rebuild ties based on trust between governments and citizens for greater economic, social, and political stability and improved transparency and accountability. This new governance with citizens can rely on improved public governance, i.e. listening to people and taking into account the social and economic challenges so as to devise adequate public policies. Since 2017, Expertise France has participated in the opening of governments in French-speaking Africa, members of the Open Government Partnership through PAGOF, funded by the AFD. It supports governments, civil society in their transparency strategy. For instance, in Côte d'Ivoire, guides for communications have been designed in order to explain to citizens how much it costs to have one procedure from the administration and thus prevent corruption. In Senegal, Expertise France supports the initiatives for participatory municipal budget that use taxes in order to highlight the use of taxes and promote citizens' participation and transparent governance. In other places, emphasis is on maintaining social cohesion. In Lebanon, the Shabake project, funded by the French Agency for Development by AFD, aims at reinforcing government's role in preventing and managing crises. What is at stake is support to the government and agencies in order to guarantee access to public services and also facilitate citizens' participation to public life, and also support discussions between communities and strengthen the democratic governance, adaptability to crisis. Everywhere, new modes of governance are emerging. So how can we support the states and the governments in these profound transformation of their governance? Well, this is the question we will put to our panelists.
Pour poser le cadre à cette conversation, je vous propose d'accueillir celui qui nous fait l'honneur d'ouvrir ce deuxième plateau.
To define the framework for our discussions, let me welcome our
de ces rencontres internationales parce qu'il y a
key speaker who has been very much involved in everything we've referred to so far. He is in a country that since the 24th of February is war-ridden with more than 8,000 fatalities. We welcome Andriy Kostin, Prosecutor General of Ukraine. Thank you very much for being with us today for this international cooperation conference.
Good evening and thank you for inviting me.
Merci. Alors la première question à laquelle on pense évidemment, c'est dans quel contexte.
Now the first question we all have in mind is this one: how can you do your job as Prosecutor General of Ukraine in this situation, in this war situation?
It is challenging, but at the same time rewarding. We do not have time to remain reluctant or lenient as our country remains in the state of war. Therefore, I, as well as my office, will do our best to remain proactive and responsive in these highly demanding circumstances. I'm also grateful for my team, prosecutors and our staff members. They share this vision and continue to work for our common objective: seek justice and accountability for victims of international crimes.
Et alors, dites-nous, justement, vous demandez la création
You've asked for the creation of a special jurisdiction
en ce moment en Ukraine.
To deal with the crimes that are currently committed in Ukraine. Can you tell us more about it?
Yes, indeed, we are appealing for a creation of the special tribunal for the crime of aggression, which is a different offense than a war crime. Aggression means military intervention into a third country and use of force against territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine that is not justified under international law. Something we have already experienced in 2014 with annexation of Crimea and occupation of eastern regions of Ukraine. And now once again, it's the very fact of invasion that is prohibited, whereas the war crimes and which are deliberate targeting and torture of civilians, indiscriminate shelling of cities, etc. Although we are investigating on national level both crime of aggression and war crimes, our jurisdiction in Ukraine is limited, as the international law does not allow prosecution of head of state or head of government or Minister of Foreign Affairs before domestic courts due to their immunity. Similarly, the International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression in our case. Therefore, we advocate for creation of special tribunal for the crime of aggression, so that the highest political as well as military leadership of Russia is held justly accountable for their misdeeds, the most heinous international crime of aggression. In parallel, we would continue to engage with national courts and the International Criminal Court as the proper and adequate forums for prosecution of war crimes and genocide.
Alors, on a entendu les crimes d'agression, les crimes de guerre. Comment est-ce que vous documentez
all crimes, aggression crimes? How do you document the ordinary quote-unquote crimes?
Although investigation and prosecution of international war crimes remains our priority, we continue to diligently undertake our mandate as an institution safeguarding order and security along with other law enforcement agencies. And I'm grateful for the unprecedented energy and efforts of my colleagues, prosecutors and investigators. We are and will continue reforms within prosecution service in close collaboration with our international partners.
Dites-nous concernant la coopération internationale.
And with regard to this international cooperation, we are told about weapons, deliveries, and appeals that are launched by Ukraine. But from the point of view of law, of the international legislation, how is this organized, this international cooperation?
We deeply value support provided by international organizations and friendly states. My office has been receiving strategic legal advice from Atrocities Crimes Advisory Group, War Crimes Accountability Team, and Council of Europe Advisory Group. We are particularly grateful to the European Commission for their financial contributions aimed to improve war crime-related IT solutions. We are closely cooperating with International Criminal Court and states which are involved in our joint investigation team, so-called JIT, that are investigating international crimes committed in Ukraine under universal jurisdiction in their respective systems. Lithuania, Poland, and Slovakia had been assisting us on the ground through mission visits from the experts. Let me also use this opportunity to express my deep appreciation for assistance provided by our French colleagues. 3 expert missions, including Bucha and Kharkiv region, and 2 mobile DNA laboratories that are invaluable in our daily business.
Et dites-nous justement, je sais que c'est une question difficile que je vous pose.
Now, here's a difficult question, I'm afraid, and it's also one of the items on our agenda for this conference today. How can you prepare for resilience, a state that is subject to a war situation?
It's really a difficult question because one cannot be prepared and one cannot await such a situation before. I believe that Ukraine, with the support of Ukrainian people, has shown to the world that we are ready to fight not only for our territorial integrity and freedom, but also for democratic values and rule-based world order. There is not ready-made solution. However, I believe the best way is by supporting capacity of population and the government in order to respond to challenges, to repress and prevent violence, as well as to maintain unity. In our case, best solution would be to equip Ukraine in this war against aggressor by timely provision of arms and weaponry, support of the ongoing reforms and building of accountability machinery, including international compensation mechanism. I strongly believe that we have clearly shown to the world that Ukraine genuinely stands by our values and principles, as well as strong will of Ukrainian people.
Merci beaucoup, André et Costine.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you very much for having participated in our meeting this afternoon from Kyiv. Of course, our hearts goes out to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian people.
Nous avoir donné notamment ces quelques mots.
Thank you very much for having shared your opinions with us on resilience. Let's now go on with our discussions. We could see with Ukraine that this is peace, of course, is very important to guarantee governance. I'd like to introduce Paul Massen, head of country support with Open Government Partnership. With you, next to you, Nicolas Gibaud. Nicolas Gibaud, you are the mayor of Bouaké, where unfortunately war also led to a lot of fatalities and casualties. Thank you very much for being with us from Bouaké. Also, Marianelle Loison, thank you very much. You're Deputy CEO of AFD, and seated next to you, Patrick Lefat, who is the president of Transparency International France. And we also have with us Niagale Bayauko, who is president of ASSN from Dakar. Thank you very much for being with us.
Sur les antennes. Alors, comment renforcer le lien entre les citoyens?
How can we strengthen the relationships between citizens and governments in terms of transparency and accountability? What is the role of civil society? Here are a few topics we will broach upon as part of our conversation. Marie-Hélène Loison, I will start with you. You're the deputy head of AFD. Maybe we can hear a few words from you about how how France can best handle its cooperation when in fact there is such a defiance and an anti-French sentiment that's growing in the Sahel region. How can you keep on with your operations in such a climate? You were speaking about that a trust between civil society and governments. You were actually referring to a more international arena. In any case, as part of cooperation, and that probably stems from France's actions in countries of operation, we only undertake actions upon the call of partners. So that's really important to establish that link with both public institutions and citizens and populations. And in the end, our objective with these projects is to improve the living standards of where we operate. Paul Masson. That's right at the heart of what you do, strengthening the trust between citizens and governments. What's the recipe? How do you go about it?
There's no secret recipe, unfortunately. But I think where you were also going, I think trust is a key element of getting it right. And how you do that is by really investing in the relationship between state and civil society, state and citizens. And we often talk about the trust in government and institutions going down across the world, which is true. But you should also look at it, how is the trust from government in the citizens? How is the state bringing in citizens in what it's doing? And especially at the local level, I think it's very important to think through how can you create a democracy not once every 4 or 5 years, but every day of the week almost. And that you do by creating opportunities for citizens to be part of things they care about, which might not be the big grand dream of democracy, of rights, but it will be about education, about schools, about roads. Are they being built? The OECD a few years ago did a very interesting research into what are the drivers of trust or mistrust. And 3 came out. One is the perception of high-level corruption. The second is the satisfaction of citizens with the quality of service. And the third one is the reliability they see and the responsiveness of government. So our model, to close, is the countries and the local governments that join our partnership commit to 3 things. 1, a real dialogue between government and civil society and citizens, other actors. Out of that comes an action plan, commitments about how they want to change the government, what the government does, the relationship between government and citizens in their context. That will be different than every country, what they focus on. And the third thing they commit to is independent oversight. So we look at the quality of the dialogue to make sure it's not just coffee and cookie type consultations, right? We listen, but we don't actually listen, as well as the ambition and the delivery of the commitments. And what we can say after 10 years is that if you really involve civil society and citizens in what you're trying to do as a government, you get 3 things. You get more ambitious commitments, ambitious reforms, you get better implementation, and you get better results over time.
Donc l'écoute est importante des populations civiles.
Okay, so it's really important to carefully listen to local communities and populations. That's how you can find the right solutions.
Niagale Bagayoko, vous êtes
Niagale Bagayolo. Here you are at the Peace and Security Forum in Dakar, where there are discussions about peace and security. You are a researcher. Could you share a few words on the limitations of such cooperation? France has been very ambitious in this respect on the ground. But you know that there are a few dead angles on the field.
Alors, nous ne l'entendons pas. Alors,
Unfortunately, we cannot hear you.
Oui, donc c'est le rôle sur le terrain du chercheur, en effet, que d'avoir un regard critique,
on the ground
j'espère toujours constructif,
or to have a critical view
mettant en œuvre des programmes d'ingénierie institutionnelle de consolidation de la paix.
For institutional programs or for peace consolidation programs,
sur la façon dont nous travaillons tous.
I must say that I have quite a number of reservations on the way we all work. Number one, and I was quite pleased to hear what Expertise France said during the first session to remedy this major problem. Local contexts with all of their specificities are not really taken into consideration. As far as I'm concerned, most international aid or cooperation programs, as far as institutional engineering and conflict prevention and peace consolidation programs are concerned, well, they're much too standardized, they're much too developed.
Beaucoup trop conçus en fonction de modèles importés qui ne maîtrisent pas
based on important models,
spécificités des environnements.
And there is not enough consideration for local contexts. This is the main barrier and obstacle. One of the main French anthropologists who lived for decades in the Sahel region and in Mali, Jean-Pierre Didier de Sardin, wrote a book whose title is particularly telling, The Revenge of Contexts. And in it, he explained the impasse in which a number of development aid programs are in. Second limitation, these programs are designed depending on interministerial coordination mechanisms, and that takes precedence over a project basis. Third limitation, we have observed that design processes, implementation and assessment processes as well for these projects respond to standards that are completely misunderstood by beneficiaries. For example, these infamous theories of change, logical frames, these milestones.
Qui domine dans ce champ. Et pour moi, cela explique en très grande partie le très faible impact.
And all of this explains, to a large extent, the little impact of these international programs on local populations. Thank you very much, Niagale Bagiou. I know you're going to have to go soon. However, before that, I wanted Madame Loison to respond to what you just said as Deputy DG for the AFD. Isn't there some kind of decorrelation between the program and the context? The French president called upon a new momentum for a win-win co-construction mechanism. Is this something that you manage to do on the ground? Of course, is the answer. Your question is in relation with the impacts we're looking for and who defines the public policies and projects, etc. So that brings us back to the relationship between institutions and citizens. At AFD level, we are in touch with states, etc., and institutions. So as part of that definition process for projects projects and programs, we need to have a participatory context to take into consideration citizen expectations and also for accountability purposes, you know, with regards to the objectives which were defined initially. Here are the results we can show today thanks to the project which was implemented. That's why it's really important for us to be able to act both on the way we may foster citizen participation in the definition and monitoring and implementation of public policies, and also from an institutional viewpoint, how can we encourage dialogue and participatory dynamics. So when we fund projects, these are not FD projects. We do not define needs. You are called upon. So yes, that's something that has changed in the general balance.
Patrick Lefa et Nicolas Djibo.
Patrick Lefa and Nicolas Djibo. Nicolas Djibo first.
J'avais envie de dire à l'échelon local, parce que évidemment,
on a local level,
vous êtes bénéficiaire, vous me disiez au téléphone.
You are a beneficiary. As you said to me yesterday on the phone, you said most major projects in Braquet, in your city, for example, you want to create the largest market in Western Africa, which should open by next summer in 2023. You said, oh, these projects could never exist without such international cooperation. So that's really important for you, that international cooperation. But how can you enter in a co-construction design? Before answering, I wanted to go back to what you said in your introduction when you introduced Bouaké as a martyr city following the 2010 crisis. Bouaké actually was in great suffering as early as 2002 when the government announced that there was a useless Côte d'Ivoire and that Bouaké was the capital of that useless Côte d'Ivoire. That 10-year period was terrible for the city of Bouaké, and it took it 30 years backwards.
À votre question, les projets sont développés ensemble.
To come back to the question you just asked, these projects are co-defined. They're not imposed in any way. As far as Bouaké is concerned, for example, Bouaké turned to the AFD
et qui a demandé à l'AFD d'être
Bouaké presented a project and asked AFD to participate in the funding of this major project. So in our example, this was a program which was co-shared. It was not imposed neither by AFD nor by the state of Côte d'Ivoire. This is a project which was co-funded by the AFD through a sovereign loan to Côte d'Ivoire. So our example is kind of opposed to the theory which is brought forward by certain top figures. And that's really important to remind this. It's really important that we should be clearing things out. Patrick Lefa, you are the head of Transparency International France. As far as accountability is concerned for public action, I would say that you can definitely shed a different light on that conversation. You worked also at the Court of Auditors for a while. Anyway, when it comes to that relationship between institutions and citizens, how is transparency necessary for good governance? Transparency is essential to install a relationship of trust between society and public decision makers, so as to avoid mistrust. And that is why we supported the Open Government Program, which aims to call governments to open their databases so as to remove any shadow of doubt as to how decisions are made.
Ça, c'est le premier aspect. Le deuxième aspect, c'est la transparence dans les processus
full respect of the general interest.
On se déporte.
Second, when it comes to conflicts of interest, when you have any relationship, any interest, when you initiate any initiative with the public authorities, you need to report that and publish that to public authorities in order for the decision-making process to be at all times
Absolument.
En matière
de corruption.
Voilà.
De corruption et évidemment d'intérêt.
To be away from any suspicion of corruption.
Sont lourds, les enjeux sont importants de cette conversation sur la résilience.
The stakes are indeed very high when it comes to the resilience of public institutions and society at large. Odile Renaud-Basso is the head of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, a very committed donor when it comes to governance. And we will hear a few words from her, and then we'll be back with you on the ways to control cooperation action, because that's where it all boils down when it comes to the relationship between society at large, civil society and governments. Odile Renaud-Basso, and we'll be back.
Bonjour à tous. C'est un grand plaisir pour moi de participer aux rencontres de la coopération organisées par Expertise France et je remercie Jérémy Pellet de m'avoir invité.
Expertise France, and I want to thank Jérémy Pellet for his invitation. Promoting good governance is one of the hallmarks of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development since its creation 30 years ago. Thanks to our technical assistance, we aim at improving the policies and the institutions and make sure that the business environment is more conducive to investment. We'll also support projects aimed at reinforcing the public agencies to boost their capacity to implement the reforms that are necessary to our projects and the countries where we operate. This applies to the three continents where we work. It's particularly true of Ukraine, where the EBRD has traditionally been the most largest institutional investor. We've been reasserting our unflinching support to Ukraine since the 24th of February. Today, this support is a financial support to meet urgent needs, enable the continuity of operation of critical infrastructure, foster international trade, and continue to finance the real economy. In parallel, our commitment to an efficient governance remains a key element of our action in this country. We pride ourselves in having contributed to improve the business landscape through legislative, regulatory, and institutional reforms to improve the operation of public companies and fight corruption. We'll also help to build up the capacity of the public administration. For instance, we supported the reform of the public procurement system. Also, we were the main driving force behind the development of ProZoro, a fully digital public procurement platform, and DeZoro, a platform enabling everyone to monitor public calls for tender. These two instruments will prove essential in the future reconstruction of the country that demands speed of action and a high degree of transparency and rigor. Another major achievement of the EBRD was the creation of a business ombudsman. This is an impartial manner to protect the rights and interests of companies in facilitating their communication with the public authorities. Finally, the program Ukraine Reforms Architecture is one of the largest technical assistance projects for the bank. With support from the EU, we've set up a team of more than 200 experts in the Ukrainian administration to help the government in devising and implementing reforms, allowing an improved functioning of the economy. This team is a major asset in the current situation. The team provides a critical support to organize humanitarian relief, pave the way to the country reconstruction, and support the work done for the EU accession process. And when the war is over and the recovery and reconstruction start, this team will be at the service of the Ukrainian government and the international community. The reconstruction of Ukraine will be a daunting task. It will require massive investment. The trust of the international community and of foreign investors will be essential to its success. Success will also depend on the business framework, sound governance in public companies, transparent procedures, and honesty of companies involved in the reconstruction. The EBRD, the BIRD, will stand by Ukraine with its technical support and its expertise. This long-standing partnership with Ukraine will be an asset and hopefully will help in building the future that the Ukrainian people deserve so much. Thank you.
Merci pour ces mots et cet éclairage d'Odile Renaud-Basso de la Banque européenne pour la reconstruction.
Of course, very grateful to the perspective opened by Odile Renaud-Basso, President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And let's go on with our discussions.
Dans un premier temps, poser le cadre,
so we define the framework and mention the various challenges, the accountability, and also how trust is important and how it can be fostered, how it can be nourished, so that there's trust between governments and citizens. But of course, you want some hard evidence that trust is there indeed. And as a journalist, very often I must tell you that I may have to say, well, this is what was promised, and these are the projects. However, very rarely do we report on the outcome of projects. So we don't really measure the efficacy of public intervention. Paul Masson, we mentioned Ukraine. So briefly, can you tell us how does OPC come up with the right tools in order to strengthen this trust between citizens and governments?
So it really depends on the situation, right? You were talking about sort of, outside imposed type of development, which I think is hardly ever the case anymore, right? It's very often locally owned, locally driven, and that's what you need to get it right. So let me give you two, three very quick examples. One is Kaduna, Nigeria, where the governor realized that the projects he was paying for, the schools, the roads, were not being built. His first step was, let me give my civil servants the tool to sort of see what happens to the project. But he has 9 civil servants in a country that's the size of half of, in a state that's the size of half of France, so he couldn't. And then he thought, wait, let me bring in the citizens as my eyes and ears. He literally called it eyes and ears. For the citizens to see, is the school there? Is the road being built? Sending that information to the government. And very important, the government promising to react. So what happened a few years down the line, you saw that the money was better spent and faster disbursed. You saw that the projects were being built at a higher quality. And citizens see that, which is my second example. In South Kivu, in the Congo, after one of the conflicts there, the government wanted to restore confidence. And what they did is they had a budget line for participatory budgeting, which you see in many countries across the world. But the interesting thing here is the citizens voted for certain things they wanted to see, a certain road repaired, a clinic repaired. And when they saw that that was actually happening, they started paying taxes. Tax collection went up 16-fold. Now that's a sign of trust. If citizens trust that the government is doing the right thing with their money, it starts moving. So you have to have that circle. Very short third example, Seoul, South Korea, started publishing information on the moment, up-to-date information about the quality of water delivered at homes. What happened is trust in the quality of water went up, but also the consumption of tap water went up with 20%. So the proof is in those concrete examples where you see citizens actually trusting what government does with them and for them.
Alors vous, Nicolas Gibaud, à Bouaké, rapidement, qu'est-ce que vous faites justement pour renforcer ce lien entre les citoyens?
What do you do in Bouaké in order to strengthen this link with your communities? Well, we've tried to improve transparency as much as we could in our project. So we introduced a local steering committee, a committee that monitors what goes on with civil society representatives, people who belong to district management committees, and also civil servants, because this project is funded by a sovereign loan, therefore the state is involved. So this local steering committee brings together all the civil servants that are locally employed and who liaise with the project sponsors and the project financiers. So this local steering committee is the first step, and the second step is the local steering committee at interdepartmental level, at interministerial level. In the local steering committee, it's the day-to-day monitoring of how well the project is going, the problems that are encountered, and all this is reported upon in a transparent manner.
Très important, Patrick Lefa.
Transparency, very, very important. As Patrick Lefa was saying, and Hélène Loison, how can we make sure that there is transparency and that the projects sponsored by AFD deliver on their objectives? Yes, indeed. And as we said in our previous discussions, it's important to measure the efficacy of development policies and also to make sure that there is accountability. Now, at AFD, we assess 50% of our projects with in-depth analysis, and gradually we improve accountability. We ask for indicators that show that the projects enable to reach the objectives. Though, of course, it's not always easy. Now, this is what AFD does. However, it's also important to make sure that there is accountability on the part of the institutions with which we work. And of course, this is in line with the open government partnerships, so that there are data, there are objectives, and citizens can hold their politicians accountable. There's yet another point that was overlooked and which is sort of the elephant in the room here. It's the fight against corruption. We all know that people are mistrust their governments when there is corruption. And obviously, as a banking institution, we have to be very vigilant. We have to make sure that there is no corruption in our projects. However, we're going to be a bit more proactive in the future, and we want to support governments that actively fight against corruption, so to support their public policies against corruption. Patrick Lefa, a very final comment. Now, of course, I can't talk on behalf of all journalists, But it seems to me that as far as trust goes, whistleblowers and journalists may have a role to play
de cette démocratie-là, et c'est ce que vous défendez d'ailleurs, je pense notamment à la procédure Bayon,
democratic environment. And this is what you're fighting for at Transparency International. Yes, indeed. You see, there's this need to make sure that whistleblowers are protected, and we need some legislation to do so, and there is a European directive which has been transposed in French law recently in March last. However, journalists also play a very important role, and in many countries they are subject to libel actions, gagging procedures, and this is why the European Union is currently drafting an anti-slap directive, an anti-gag procedure to fight against these procedures that prevent journalists from speaking up, in order to make sure that the media can work as they should. And everything was spurred by the assassination of a journalist in Malta. She was the victim of 47 lawsuits. These so-called gag procedures. In Italy, there are more than 6,000 cases that are just set aside by the courts. And there are thousands of procedures against journalists, thousands of lawsuits against journalists in Italy every year. So whistleblowers must be protected. We need to listen to civil society, and whenever there are some hints that freedom is curtailed, we need to be aware that it's a sign of big problems and possibly corruption. Thank you very much, Patrick Lefebvre. Thank you very much to Marie-Hélène Loison, Paul Massen,
and
Nicolas Dubo, Mayor of Bouaké, and Nyagale Bagayolo, who was with us from Dakar. Now, again, we want, as I said earlier on, to be open to what people in various environments do. And this is the case with Marie Binebine, who is a novelist and a painter. His works are on view at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And some years ago, he decided to open centers dedicated to young people, because these young people were left to their own devices, victims of either terrorist groups or who just wanted to leave their countries and had no hope. So we are going to listen to what he did for them. In 2003, 14 young people from a slum called Sidi Moumen in the suburb of Casablanca, they wreaked havoc in the city, leading to 45 fatalities and some 100 casualties. They were human bombs who had been brainwashed by a religious mafia rooted in the slum. I wanted to understand what was happening to us. Terror attacks were new to us. We thought we were immune to them. Well, in fact, no. Our children were responsible for this bloodshed. So I went to the slum, I met with associative actors, and I wanted to understand what went on. And on this basis, I wrote a novel entitled The Stars of Sidi Moumen. Now, this book was very successful because for the first time, these young people were described not as monsters like in American movies, but as victims. These are poor kids. They've been brainwashed, and therefore, if someone must be blamed for it, I think it should be the state. They just leave 400,000 people in these deplorable conditions, or it's the religious mafia. They take advantage of the misery, the poverty of these young guys. You can also say that those who are well off and who pay workers very mean salaries are also responsible for what happened. So the book was very successful, and based on it, the film director Nabil Ayouch shot the movie God's Horses, who made quite a lot of money out of it all. And so we wanted to share it with the children. And we decided to open a cultural center named after my book, The Stars of Sidi Moumen in the Slum. The Stars of Sidi Moumen, you see there is cinema, music, dance, language classes on offer in this center. Languages are so important. Young people must understand that they should learn languages to communicate with others who are not their enemies. They love hip-hop, computer science, everything. We were absolutely surprised by their enthusiasm. 1,000 of them signed up in the first few months. Now, unfortunately, we couldn't take more, and so we looked for the possibility of opening other centers. There are already 6 centers open, and we'd love to extend this to other places in sub-Saharan Africa. Each center welcomes 1,000 youth, and in each center, we give them the possibility to dream instead of hanging around or fall prey to dangerous mafia. Well, they come to us, and we tell them, you're wonderful. We tell them, you are our stars, and they become wonderful people. Why is it that we always have to wait for the Western world to point us in the right direction? I think we can find it ourselves and try and improve what can be improved in our countries.
Voilà pour les mots de Maï Binbin qui arrivent en
Binbin. It's a wonderful conclusion after these 2 panel sessions, the first one on just transition, the second one on governance and resilience. And of course, we'd like to have some concluding remarks with Jérémy Pellet, CEO of Expertise France, and Rémi Rioux, CEO of AFD, Agence Française de Développement. Thank you very much for your attendance. Now, we had 2 hours and a half with a lot of fruitful discussions.
Such great debates. 3 words I do take away from these exchanges: justice, time, and human people. Justice, because we spoke of a just transition with an interesting debate that was brought about by Madame Diop. What do we mean by a just transition? A balanced or a fair transition? Justice also as a key vector of trust in institutions, as the Ukrainian Prosecutor General said. Today, we need to act urgently. However, in the future, the Ministry of Justice will be instrumental in restoring that trust with us citizens. And also justice means that there will not be winners and losers. That's exactly what Josefa spoke of in her message. And there's also that long-term approach and change in mindsets, and the emergency in what we need to do, as Kunduns rightly said. And for cooperation agencies, for aid institutions, we need to adapt. We need to find the right timing. amongst all of these actions, to co-construct all of these projects in a long-term approach in order not to jump from one emergency to the next. One last keyword for me, people, the human aspect. It's been at the heart of our exchanges. There was even a talk of acupuncture with Aurélien Le Chevalier. He did, indeed, acupuncture in the sense of expertise, France's efficiency in its actions. What a telling metaphor. We also spoke of local environments with Niagara by Cayolo. We spoke of that social relationship. How can we embody locally with the example of the city of Bouaké? How can you fix that human link with the martyr city of Bouaké? That was such a beautiful example of this. So a wealth of discussion and three key actions for us that I take away from this conversation. First of all, within Expertise France, we need to be a public advisor. We need to be a local partner for our beneficiaries. We really need to stand by our partners along with AFD. Also, we need to keep on working on that link between our technical expertise and the political dialogue. This is a two-way conversation, and we have seen these various dimensions during the first roundtable specifically. One last point, faced with such major challenges, we need to be humble. We need to listen, to truly understand, and to co-construct tomorrow's solutions. Very interesting, such a framework. Quite a wealth of debates indeed. More than 2 hours of conversation. Rémi Rioux, who was here on stage, Marie-Hélène Loison, your deputy director, reminded us of what the AFD stands for internationally. But we would like to perhaps turn to the future with you. What are your key takeaways from today's conversation, and what will the future uphold for international cooperation in France? Thank you, Fatimata. Thank you, Jeremy, for inviting me today. And congratulations for the second edition of the International Cooperation Conference. This is quite a special week for us, and indeed, less than a week ago, we were in Abidjan for the Finance in Common Summit, which gathers all public banks around the world. And with Expertise France, Probaco, and the AFD, we have such a great team of committed people who stand together, and hopefully we can together with other players, shed a light on the future. You focused on two cross-cutting issues, the fair transition. We also call that the 100% ODD. It means the exact same thing, the fight against climate change for biodiversity. This is something we do to a large extent, along with Expertise France, with the Rune program or our action program to boost the resilience of countries. That transition does need to be just, and it's in line with what we do in India, in Indonesia, in Senegal. You know, that movement to reconcile of these tensions the world is going through right now. And then there was the other cross-cutting issue of how can we do all of this? How can we go about this collectively? So that brings about questions of governance, citizenship, democracy, And Expertise France's support in AFD in this respect is
je dirais la démocratie par en bas, c'est-à-dire
essential. How do you go from grassroots projects to empower women and communities, and you go all the way up to a certain to more inclusiveness within states in the way that we work. Sometimes people tend to think and say that democracy is something that happens top-down, but in fact it's a bottom-up approach. How does a democracy emerge? What are the economic and environmental foundations of it? By gathering all cooperation instruments within our group, we are in a great position to address. I'm not saying that we have all of the responses, but yes, we can address them. Thank you to the both of you for these concluding remarks. It was a pleasure for me to moderate these exchanges. More than 1,300 people joined in online and followed these conversations, and I am sure that this conference has garnered great interest. So thank you. Thank you very much indeed to all of our participants and speakers here in the studio and live from other locations. Thank you to everyone at Expertise France who has participated in the participation, more specifically Anaïs Rieu and Gilles Bismuth, and all of their teams. Thank you very much indeed. It was a pleasure. Stay tuned. And for those who might have posted questions and did not have any answers, I'm quite sure that everyone will still be here to provide you with answers. Thank you all. See you next.